You've landed on The Substance, a podcast aimed at being biblical, thoughtful, and human. Join us each week as we engage the culture without the culture war. I'm your host, Philip Marinello, here with my friends and co-hosts, Trevor Aiken.
Howdy, howdy. Bringing it back.
And Vincent Edwards.
What's going on?
Here at The Substance, we are a Christian variety show. We have long form, short form, media, and today we've got an interview. As you can see, since you already clicked on the title here, we're here with Phillip Holmes, most recently used to be the host of Pass the Mic, here today talking about Make It Plain. Welcome to The Substance, Phillip.
What's up, fellas? How y'all doing?
Very good.
Doing
Oh,
well.
man. I'm seeing double. I got two Phillips. We got a Phillip with two L's.
Thanks for having me. So, I see you turned on your radio voice. I was like, did he click
I did.
click a
That
button
got
or
real
something?
bad.
Did you click the button?
Did he
Yep.
press a button? This is like a
I got
podcast auto tune or something?
Trevor is usually the one, and I call him on it every time. I deserve that. I
Got
deserve
him.
that.
No, man, I was feeling it. I was like,
No,
I
it's
wish
good.
I could do that.
Yeah, that's what you got to do. Yeah,
My morning
It's-
radio voice.
I just save that EQ as a preset and just apply that whenever he gets a little too crunchy or whatever. You just need
There
to
you go.
smooth.
He plus one of those GarageBand plugins or something,
Yep.
Yeah,
and it's just, well, okay, cool.
It's the Phillip on Phillip roast hour
this
here
is your
today.
your smooth evening.
These are compliments. These are
With
So,
Phillip
Phillip,
compliments.
Marinello.
we're here. We want to talk a lot about the new podcast, Make It Plain, but you're very well accomplished fellow already. How do you typically introduce yourself?
I mean, I was joking with a dear brother of mine that I've seen a lot. So I've worked in several large evangelical ministries. Like I was telling you guys earlier, I co-founded the Reformed African American Network, which is now The Witness with Jamar Tisby. So Jamar and I go way back. Actually, when I met my wife, Jasmine, I was interviewing her for Pass the Mic.
I love that. I
Love
did not
it.
know that.
Podcast
Yeah,
bringing
yeah.
folks together.
Yeah, man, that was a TGC conference.
Was she a
crazy.
writer or a speaker? She wasn't writing at that point, was she?
Nah, well, she had written a book, but we don't talk about that book.
Oh,
But she
okay.
had written a book, and
Was it like a good book, or you're like, I want to talk to that girl?
I hadn't read the book, but I knew she was a writer, and of course, I knew Vodi. So we were at the conference, introduced myself, and basically, I guess the rest is history. We were friends for like a year, and then we ended up dating, and then 6 months after we started dating, we got married. So
There you go.
Congrats.
yeah.
That's the conservative
Found a good
conservative
Yeah.
guy meets conservative girl story.
I guess we probably that timeline we question our sanity, our maturity, our wisdom, but the Lord is gracious.
That's
I'm
right.
with you
So-
on that one.
Yeah.
That's right. That is how it goes sometimes in relationships. You look back and you're
Oh.
like, I don't know. I think emotions were leading in a lot of ways, but the Lord was good, and
Yeah.
stay faithful to the
100%.
covenant, right?
He was every step of the way. He's been so gracious and kind to us. Yeah.
That relationship, like your relationship with Jasmine, is such an interesting part that plays into this, right? Because she's such a big part of the story of why Make It Plain exists. You had her
Mhm.
on the podcast, but early on you were talking about you saw she had a poster on her wall, and you're like, "Whoa, wait a second!" So,
Was
like,
she
what
living
was-
on her? How did that go down?
yeah, I was really curious about the Malcolm X poster on the wall, and like where the background and how you guys got into conversations about some of those things.
Oh yeah. I mean, her dad introduced her to Malcolm X. That's why I love it when people say I'm promoting CRT. I'm just like, I know how I got this, right? This was passed down. But it's just people. People don't think, man, and they don't know what they don't know, and a lot of
right.
people haven't been discipled. They've been taught
That's right.
what to think, but they haven't been taught how to think. And
That's exactly it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the poster was a part of our marriage. We've kept it, and it wasn't until recently. What really made me dive into it was the autobiography came out, and my boy Lawrence Fishburne was reading it, and I was like, all right, now it's time. Now it's
The
time for
audiobook?
me to the audiobook. And
I didn't hear
I
you read the Alex Haley one.
Yes, man,
I didn't
100%
know that.
recommend it.
I bet that's
Go,
fantastic.
oh, you have no idea.
Jasmine has talked about it so much. I'm kind of, listeners might not know, like I kind of came to Malcolm X. I had a very similar perception of him that you did, that you talk about on the podcast, where I knew him. I knew he probably did, like, he was important. He did some good things, but the overall kind of coloring of him in my mind was negative, just kind of vaguely and generally negative.
Yeah.
All the things that he talked about himself, all of the things that he said, this is how people are going to paint me. That is, it's not explicitly, like I didn't have people sit down and paint an aggressively negative picture. It was just kind of like he was not the good one of the civil rights. Like Dr. King was the good one. He was the kind of radical, zealot, violent guy. Like that's kind of what I had in my head before I saw some of Jasmine's stuff.
Yeah.
So if I can, like, really quick for the listeners who have popped into this episode and like really jamming with us so far, but maybe are now like, why in the world are we talking about Malcolm X? Let's talk a little bit about the podcast. Like, what is your podcast, Make It Plain, for folks who are coming to this fresh, have never heard of Make It Plain, don't know the subject of it, don't know the heart behind it. Give people a little intro into what we're talking about and what we're going to be kind of thinking through this next hour.
Yeah, so there's multiple different layers. So of course Jasmine is telling me she loves Malcolm X, and I'm just kind of really confused. Decided to read and what led to me reading the autobiography was I was having a conversation with my dear brother Taelor Gray, who I met at the same conference that I met Jasmine. So that particular conference in 2013 was like game changer. Everybody who's well known, African American guys, most of them were there, but at that time we were all like just happy to be there. And it's just really interesting now to reflect on how much has changed over the last, less than a decade at this point. So Taelor and I are doing an Instagram live, and Taylor's from the North. I'm from the South. So those dynamics are very significant when it comes to his view of King and my view of Malcolm. We're on an Instagram live because Taelor and I have been wanting to do something together because we've just always vibed. Chemistry has always been strong. Even when, we've had differing views over the years, there was this mutual respect. And you don't find a whole lot of people like that. Where you guys can engage each other thoughtfully. And Taelor and I just kind of always had that chemistry from day one. And Taelor was rocking with the Reform African American Network, Pass the Mic, all that stuff from day one, and has written quite a bit for The Witness as well. So Taelor and I are on the live, and he asked me a question about Malcolm X. And I was just like, now if we had been private, I probably would have been not as careful because I think we had that conversation has kind of happened one point. But Taelor asked me something about Malcolm, and I was just like, man, honestly, bro, I don't know enough about Malcolm to be able to even speak to that. And he was like, okay, that's fair. And I was like, but that's definitely on my bucket list. So
that's a good answer too. When you don't know something, listeners, take note. When you don't know something, it's okay.
Say you don't know.
So basically the autobiography with Lauren Fishburne reading it came out a little bit later, and I was like, yo, this is the time, because I love Lawrence, and I've been wanting to check this out, and it was phenomenal. It absolutely changed my life, opened my eyes, made me start asking so many different questions, because here was a man who was essentially very different than the way that he had been portrayed. Now, people have to understand, too, my impressions of Malcolm X came from probably some of the broader culture, but, I grew up in an all-black town. I went to an all-black high school. So my early thoughts about Malcolm X were developed in a black church community. So the dynamics that I think people sometimes overlook, it's not just sort of the evil white man that's painting this picture of Malcolm, although I think that they're the ones that perpetuated a certain narrative about Malcolm, and I think many African Americans bought that. But there's also the reality that there's religious differences here that play
Right.
a significant difference, right? Because it's easier to believe that when somebody is the other, right? It's easier to believe the worst about that person.
Yeah,
so if
that's
I'm
true.
a Christian, this person is a Muslim, and I you know, I believe that my way is the right way, and I want to push that narrative. I think that Christians, regardless of your ethnicity, can be complicit in the slander that oftentimes take place because we're not used to engaging and talking across the aisle to people who think differently than we
Yeah.
are. Yeah, so we don't humanize our opponents. It's easier to villainize them, and so after I read the autobiography, you know, the name "Make It Plain" came from. This is something that is interesting because it's a black church saying, right? So when the preacher is preaching, "Make it plain, Doc," right?
Yep.
But this is also something that Malcolm would say. But when Malcolm would say it is interesting, he was saying basically wrap it up, like make it plain, say what you need to say, make it clear, right, and sit down.
Yeah.
When it was time for him to when guys would be introducing him, essentially. But I thought that it was an appropriate name for a podcast. The other one that we were thinking about was "Home to Roost," which is also from one of Malcolm's famous quotes that, you know, after Kennedy was assassinated, he just basically said, you know, when chickens came home to roost, as a farm boy, when chickens came home to roost, it never made me mad, it made me glad. And when you understand what Malcolm is saying as it relates to chickens coming home to roost, that what he's essentially saying is America has basically perpetuated, enabled a culture of violence, and people should not be surprised when that violence eventually basically turns on you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can't allow Black people in America to be terrorized and treated and oppressed and treated the way they were treated, and assume that at some point the same thing isn't going to happen to you. And that's essentially what he was saying was what took place with Kennedy. So to answer your original question, Make It Plain is simply a podcast with me, Taelor Gray, and we offer Christian reflections on the words and life of Malcolm X.
Wow, that's awesome. Reeling it in for the person who's like, all right, so you kind of giving me the elevator pitch of what this is. But as a Christian, let's assume they're saying they're having a hard time getting out of that box that you were just talking about. It's like, well, Malcolm X but he was a Muslim and he was an extremist, and I am a Christian, and I do believe that what I believe is truth. What's the value, especially for a believer, to engage in the content that you and Taelor are presenting?
I would say question everything that you think you know about Malcolm X. Because even labeling him as an extremist, and I know this isn't you're simply representing the audience or the questioner, but with Malcolm, people oftentimes do view him as an extremist, but he really wasn't. Malcolm, a lot of Malcolm's views when it came to violence, self-defense, and all that was very much similar to what we see in conservative America.
I was just gonna say when you dropped that on the podcast, it's like that's pretty much the Republican stance on
100%.
gun rights.
Yeah.
Like if somebody comes at me, I'm gonna light them up. Like
Yeah.
What did
Have
Malcolm
every right
say? Oh, we're not nonviolent. We're not violent people. We're only violent. We're nonviolent people. We're only violent with people who are violent with us.
Right.
Yeah.
Stand your ground. You're gonna take my rifle, take it out of my cold dead hands. Like, so as I'm reading Malcolm, I'm just like, this sounds like a Republican to me. You know,
this is a white conservative.
But a lot of people don't really know Malcolm, so they form these opinions. They make these broad generalizations based on, you know, a movie that they saw, and probably didn't even watch the whole movie.
It's a long movie.
It's a long movie. Real talk. And they just don't know who Malcolm is. So make sure that whatever you're basing your opinion of Malcolm on is based on reality and not based on what you've heard.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's definitely been a struggle for me, and your podcast has encouraged me to dig a little bit deeper in that space and kind of understand, because my background, as far as my understanding of Malcolm, is probably average white suburban kids, understanding, right? Like, he was a guy, he was basically like the wrong side of the civil rights movement coin, right? Like, you're presented, and I'm not saying this is accurate, right? But you're presented with King was kind of the hero, and then like Malcolm is kind of like the dark side of the civil rights movement, in a way, is how it's presented. And like,
Right.
whereas King presented the way of nonviolence, Malcolm was the way of kind of forceful or revolution or things like that. And obviously Christian versus Muslim, you've already mentioned. And then I think the other one is, we even joked on the podcast once, like, by any means necessary. MLK was only willing to obtain his ends through just and moral things, whereas it seems like Malcolm was willing, it was like by any means necessary, to obtain freedom. Like, that's how it's kind of presented to me. So how would you interact with that? Like, I know I probably just said a bunch of things that you're like 80% of that is wrong. But how would you
see episode 1, misunderstanding Malcolm?
Yeah, but how would you interact with some of that? Like, because I think that is the word on the street, right? Like, people hearing this, like, that is where they start a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm.
What would you ask of somebody who's starting there?
Where did you get your information from?
Mm.
Because both of those views of King and Malcolm are flawed and cherry picked to create a narrative that's convenient and that's digestible for those who enjoy good guy, bad guy narratives. And,
Yeah, it's digestible for people who don't like to think a whole lot. I think one of the most simple little nuggets that Jamar dropped when he was here, and I've heard him talk about it elsewhere too, is that racism is lazy. Like, the caricatures of Malcolm X and Dr. King, like, if you just think about them and you do any primary sort, like, forget reading. These men were around not too long ago. There's video. Like, you can watch and hear these men talk in their own words and answer questions directly. Like, you don't have to do a whole lot of work to have a better perspective than
literally
the really
a YouTube search can
caricatures out there.
The reality is that Malcolm predicted how America would view him. He recognized the narrative that the press wanted to create, that the media wanted to create, and he wrote an entire autobiography to help people understand him. And 60 years later, Christians primarily, I think that probably in the broader culture, there are those definitely that are outside the church that probably appreciate what we're doing and would make it plain. There's some people who just don't read anyway, so they're not like really interested or haven't really educated themselves on Malcolm X. But Malcolm X's book has been on the bestseller list over several decades, but it hasn't been because Christians have been buying it. And here's the other reality. The reality is that people don't know King as well as they think they do.
That's true too, man.
Very true.
King and Malcolm was very interesting how they didn't necessarily come to agreement, but they definitely moved towards each other towards the end of their lives.
Yeah.
And what people have to recognize is that by the time, and I follow Dr. King's daughter on Twitter, and she constantly reminds people that when Dr. King was assassinated, he was not very well liked in America. One of the reasons why he wasn't liked in America is because after the Civil Rights Act was passed, people basically just wanted him to shut up.
He's like, "Yeah, guys, it didn't work."
It wasn't that. Yeah, well, what Dr. King was wise in some ways because he was trying to move the needle. People have to recognize that many of the rights that Dr. King was fighting for, Malcolm already had.
That's the Alabama, New York difference.
100%. Yeah. So of course, King is a lot more measured, right, in his words. And a lot more, he's realized like there's a way that you navigate the South And you navigate it by basically pushing, moving the needle. And I think that mentality is very much prevalent today when it comes to how guys, even the evangelical culture, think about a lot of the racial issues that are taking place versus guys who might be in the North. But the reality is King and Malcolm were fighting very different battles. There was a common enemy or opponent in some ways, but Malcolm recognized that you're simply trying to get the right to vote, and we're telling you that that's not going to look like what you think is going to look like on the other side, because we have those rights.
Yeah.
We have this, and we're still, racism isn't just going to go away. And there's also the dynamic too that by King saying that he was nonviolent, it made it oftentimes seem as if, and I think that Malcolm talked about how basically people like King were being subsidized by the white man. I don't know if that's necessarily a direct indictment, definitely an indirect indictment of King, but I think it's more of a direct indictment of the white man and how they were using King's words in order to oppose Malcolm. So Malcolm is not pro-violence; he's pro-defense. Right? That's very
Pro-human
different.
dignity. If you look at it from Christian terms, like he was defending the dignity of himself and his fellow man when pushed.
Yeah, sure. So the reality is that you can't look at Malcolm and King as polar opposites, because they never really were that. They were forced into those roles, and I think King was more hesitant to, because he, I didn't even realize this, but I didn't realize that King was in the White House and that King had access to the president during the "I Have a Dream" era and all that stuff. I didn't realize that King was as well liked and as and not really liked, but he definitely had more access than Malcolm did to hire platformed. Yes. So even King was very hesitant about publicly associating with Malcolm. And think about it. It works the same way today. People judge you based on who you publicly associate with.
I can't tell you how many people said, "Why do you have XYZ person on your podcast?" Or
for
why
sure.
why do you read those books? Why do you tell people that these books are channels have value?
And no one today will question you over associating with MLK. Like, even the most, honestly, guys, the most racist folks will quote MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech. You know what I mean? Like they act like MLK was the proponent of the colorblind kind of, whitewash everything utopia that they think, which
people
literally, if you only take one phrase of MLK, that's what you get. But associating with Malcolm, I feel like in the Christian space, at least, is very much going to be questioned in some.
I've had people call my employer concerned about me promoting CRT. I had a pastor, a guy I went to college with and that I was in seminary with, essentially call my boss and say, "Hey, Phillip's quoting Malcolm favorably and is affirming aspects of CRT and something like that." And I'm like, "Well, definitely yes to the Malcolm, 100%.
That's part of the show."
CRT. I mean, yeah, right. The CRT part, cautious. It's a lot more complicated. Definitely not pro CRT. But definitely, I probably would have been a little bit more vocal about my concerns, and I have been vocal about my concerns, but I would have been way more vocal about my concerns. But I noticed that something in the atmosphere had changed, and that CRT was being weaponized, and that a lot of people that were talking about it didn't know what they were talking about. And I was like, wait, hold up. Talking about, y'all are conflating a lot of things with CRT that are not CRT. And that's when, of course, they at that point, people would love for you to continue. Well, you're not saying anything against CRT yet, because I'm not going to play that game. I'm not gonna participate in the narrative that you guys are essentially trying to push, which is a false narrative. So
So that's actually a good reminder to me. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, you talk about it on the show, what can we learn from Malcolm? What are some lessons from his character, life, writings, just about that intellectual honesty? Because not that he was a perfect example of that and that he lived it out perfectly, but you guys hit that on the show, and I thought that was really encouraging, and something that we talk about a lot here is that, like, intellectual honesty. Things are either correct or they're not, and like that's important. Not the narratives, not the spin. So what are some things that we can learn from Malcolm in that regard?
Yeah, Malcolm was a sharp thinker. He didn't accept the easy answers. As he and part of this was because Malcolm was determined to grow as a person. So in a lot of ways, Malcolm was extremely gullible and naive, understandably so, when you think about his relationship with Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah.
But over time, Malcolm began to see the hypocrisy, the inconsistencies, and he was able to evolve in such a way where, I often say that, I might be slow, but mama didn't raise no fool. I'm not. My goal is not necessarily always to be the first one to get to the truth. But once I get there, I want to make sure that my understanding is firmly rooted and is grounded in substance and intellectual integrity, where I arrived there because I was convinced, not because it was the flavor of the day.
Right.
And when I see guys tossing to and fro from this to that, I'm like, bro, you ain't changing your mind. You ain't having a strong opinion about all this stuff just at a convenient time. But they kind of always want to be, and this is what I felt like. Malcolm is the type of guy that will probably argue you down about something. And then once he was convinced that you were right, he would flip on a dime. But until then, he was going to stand his ground. One of the things that one of my favorite quotes from Malcolm, he says this: despite my firm convictions, I have always been a man who tries to face the facts and to accept the reality of life as a new experience and new knowledge unfolds it. I have always kept an open mind, which is necessary to the flexibility that must go hand in hand with every form of intelligent search for truth.
Yeah.
Boom.
Man, that's accurate.
It's powerful.
You have to listen to people.
Yeah.
And Malcolm was willing to make hard decisions, to change his mind, to publicly say that he was wrong. He always had to tell people, listen, I'm not the same man that I was yesterday. And when you quote me, here's what I actually said. Because Malcolm was a complex man who was really searching, I think, for the truth as best as he humanly could.
Man,
how has as you kind of had this chance to reflect over these things that Malcolm's saying and some of these good nuggets of truth that are here, how has that influenced your work in ministry?
I think here's what I appreciated about Malcolm. Malcolm resonated with the man that I was already aspiring to be. And I didn't know, and I was so ashamed in some ways, because I know how easy and how often I've been misunderstood because of my strong opinions and how much I've evolved, over the years and the way that I view things. One of my favorite quotes from Malcolm, he was also a gracious man. He was like, don't look down on someone just because you essentially arrived to the truth before they did. He says that there was always a point in time where you didn't know. There was once upon a time where you didn't know what you knew today.
That's right.
And that's a paraphrase. And so that even gets you into the mentality of Malcolm, is that he didn't care about being the first. He was just happy when people got to where he was, when people became enlightened, when people began to see the truth. And that's why I think he was so adamant about reaching across the aisle, because this is what progressive and conservative Christians, non-Christians will do, especially within the Black community. They will have you not associating with people because they don't necessarily fit your particular tribe, right?
Wow.
So this person is poison, this person is bad. You know, one of the things that has frustrated me about Christianity is the tribalism and how quickly people throw people away.
Wow.
And have strong opinions just because this person has a bad take on something. And you know, one of the things that Rosaria Butterfield said a long time ago,
Yes.
to me when I got a chance to interview her, and I think I asked her about one of the individuals who was perpetuating a particular false doctrine, and I asked her if there's any hope, and she was like, "Phillip, where there's life, there's always hope."
Wow.
100%.
And that has always stuck with me, with people having terrible takes, with individuals having views that I think are dangerous to the body of Christ, with even individuals going as far as walking away from the faith. The reality is that where there's life, there's hope, and where the Spirit of God reigns, repentance is always possible.
Amen.
Wow.
And we've all been in darkness and thought at the time that we were walking in the light. We've all been zealous at some point about something that turns out we were actually really wrong about it.
Amen to that. Yes.
And so there's a certain type of humility that should come as we're navigating sort of these quote unquote culture wars. And what I see oftentimes is individuals not even just taking strong stances against ideas, but strong stances against people.
That's the thing. That's the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You talk in your podcast about kind of how, though Malcolm had this reality of who he was and how he presented himself in the public, how in his autobiography he said, you know, the perception of me is going to be negative. And so that bleeds heavily into our understanding and interaction with media. So talk to us a little bit about that just what you've observed of the similarities of how media consumption and journalism in that sense can really shape our perceptions and how we interact with certain ideas or certain individuals.
Yeah, everything is oftentimes written out of a worldview or a bias. So often when it comes to the media, people and brands, because what we got to recognize right now, we're living in a different time. So when Malcolm was alive, when Dr. King was alive, especially in his last day, the media hated Malcolm. They loved him, but they hated him. He was good news. He was a good interview, but
He's clickbait.
He was clickbait, right? People were going to watch him even if they hated him, while they listened to him, but also right after that misrepresented him. What a lot of people don't realize though is that when King, towards the end of his life, was assassinated, the Washington Post, the New York Times, these were all at the time the liberal, non-racist media outlets. None of them had much good to say about King. And the reason why was because Dr. King was engaging in starting the Poor People's Campaign. And he was also against the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Because King's logic was, we're spending all of that money to send people across the seas to fight another man's war and to die, yet we have people here in the United States starving without basic necessities, and everybody hated him. So this is why the King narrative that everybody wants you to, it's almost like if you didn't know any better, and if you're not familiar with the timeline, you will assume that he did the "I Have a Dream" speech, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and in retaliation to that, King was assassinated. That is not what happened. That is not what happened, but that's what a lot of people think, because that's what we've been taught.
Yeah.
So King, I still don't think that King was assassinated because he, made it so black people and white people can use the same restroom, or that black people in the South could vote. I don't think that was the case. And then you kind of get into conspiracy theories, but when you read the entire narrative, something was not right, and you also know that the FBI hated King.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
They hated King, and I'm not one for conspiracy theories, or at least sharing my conspiracy theories public. I have private ones, but I think conspiracy theories are best kept, in private conversations. But that's the reality. So now, when it comes to the media, and I'll say this because I think this full circle answers your question. What we have to recognize is that times have changed. The media is no longer just Christianity Today, Washington Post, New York Times, Huffington Post, blah blah blah.
Right.
We are the media.
Yeah.
You guys are the media.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such, because of social media, there's no such thing as a gatekeeper anymore.
Yeah. Yikes. That's a good thing and a bad thing.
100%. 100%. I've been saying for the longest is that the thing about social media is that before social media, the ignorant and the crazies thought they were the only one.
Now
Man.
they can
Now they
form
found their
Facebook
tribe.
groups.
They found people. You too. It's kind of the dark side of the C.S. Lewis. You too.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and then they can all show up in the real world and do stupid stuff, right? Like that's
like attack the Capitol.
Yeah, like a Capitol riot.
But you went there, yeah, 100%.
Well,
No,
they
that's-
literally created that crazy platform to do that, and then now it's all on record because they thought they were being slick.
It's bonkers, man. For folks who maybe don't know the full story of Martin Luther King because they haven't been able to look, or they haven't just taken the time to look, we can link his Stanford speeches on YouTube and illustrates greatly all this stuff that Philip's been talking about. But
also the NBC interview that he did 11 months before he was assassinated, he talks about how the "I Have a Dream" speech was that one. That's the one that people talk about. They don't play the part where he talks about the "I Have a Dream" speech, and that period of time he was a bit naive.
Wow.
He said that in that same interview. And
Wow.
I have the interview transcribed, and we're going to be releasing it when the new Make It Plain site is launched in a month or so.
All right.
Yeah,
Man,
that's gonna be awesome.
We'll link to
I do
that, and
remember
that's amazing. But these guys have these great insights on America, and I'm wondering, like, as you've been reading, you've given us so many good insights about Malcolm's character and how that broadly that like gives us these character traits that we should employ, whether it's critical thinking or being open-minded or these kind of things. But what are some particular critical insights into the country in which we find ourselves that Malcolm kind of opened your eyes to, as far as the way like America functions? Like when you approach the situation and the place that God has ordained us to be born into here in America, what are some ways that Malcolm helped you understand that in particular a little better?
Yeah, so Malcolm really helped me understand the reality and the dynamics of power. So when I started talking about this and thinking through this website and wanting to, Home to Roost was essentially the name or the title that I was working with. And as I mentioned to you guys earlier, Home to Roost is a nod to Malcolm, as the saying was made infamous, rather, by the civil rights hero. So I'm looking for the quote, because I want to make sure. Here's what he said. So in December of 1963, a reporter asked Malcolm how he felt about John F. Kennedy being assassinated, and this is what he said in response: "Being an old farm boy myself, chickens coming home to roost never made me sad. They only made me glad." Of course, people were outraged by this. Kennedy loved people. Black people and white people loved Kennedy. And later, when he was interviewed, Malcolm accused the media of distorting his comments. And he explained that Kennedy's assassination was the result of a climate of hate, and that chickens coming home to roost means the same thing. Chickens coming home to roost is used when a person, an institution, or a society's past actions are the cause of the problems they are experiencing in the present.
Yeah.
Now, think about where we are in this current cultural climate.
Yep.
Because I want people to, there's a new podcast that's out called Mike Cosper. My guy Mike Cosper. Shout out to Mike
The
Cosper.
rise and fall
Rise
of
and
Mars
fall.
Hill.
The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Thank you. I listened to the first episode.
Mm.
Mike's a beast. He's a great storyteller. I haven't, but I have. You know what? I struggled after the first episode when everybody started listening and raving over it. And the reason why is this: there's a disconnect that often takes place when people are talking about the extreme, quote unquote, extreme cases. Like Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. Here's the reality. Mark Driscoll isn't really that extreme.
Yeah.
He just was successful.
I think that's, to me, that's been the message. I mean, I'm not trying to defend necessarily Rise and Fall, but like, to
I
me,
don't think anything's wrong. No. And I want to be clear.
Yeah. That's what made it connect.
But here's the reality. It's deeper than that. And I don't necessarily know if Mike goes this far with it. He very, very much so. Because again, this is not Mike's my boy. And I think he's an amazing storyteller. So I know Mike personally. It was watching white evangelicals not draw the connections between racism and the power that was abused over centuries. What people have to understand is, and Diane Langberg talks about this in her book, racism, slavery, oppression. People have to recognize that oppression does not only affect the mindset of the oppressed.
100%.
That's right.
It also warps the mind of the oppressor.
Sin will do that, right?
And that type of thinking, distorted thinking, this culture of abuse, this culture that has to justify this. Remember, these were Christians. In the South, who perpetuated and upheld slavery for centuries.
They had to make room in their theology for that abuse.
And we know today that the Bible is absolutely clear that what they were doing was evil. So what do you have to do in order to allow yourself to walk in that type of darkness, not just for one generation, not just for two generations, but for multiple generations? Because people oftentimes act as if these people that we're talking about, Jonathan Edwards, were repentant in their lifetime.
Right.
When you think about slavery, slavery wasn't viewed as a bad thing when it was abolished. That's why our war was fought.
Yeah. And even the people who were abolishing it were not like they weren't necessarily believing in the full humanity and dignity of all people either. Even the people who were abolitionists.
It wasn't even a hard switch. And you can say all you want that it was what's the best way to put it? They were men of their time, but the reality is that Europe was very much involved in the slave trade, and they did not do what America did.
That's right.
I think we also have to remember too. We can talk about Europe and where it is today all we want, but the reality is that the best of what we have theologically was exported from Europe. Now it didn't originate there. But when you think about the Westminster Confession of Faith, the London 1689 Confession, which is just the plagiarized version of the Westminster Confession, right? The reality is that these were individuals who saw something was wrong and they repented, so much so that Charles Spurgeon wouldn't even fellowship with Southern slaveholders.
Right.
I was reading. I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. It has nothing to do with my last name being Holmes. Love Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has a short story called the Adventures of the Five Pips, and it's about the KKK. I think it's the Adventures of the Five Pips. Let me look that up real quick. The Five Orange Pips is the name of it, and it's all about the KKK. So even when Sherlock is publishing this, I'm sorry, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock was a real person, guys. When he was publishing this
His
in
autobiography of Sherlock Holmes.
in 1891, less than 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, over in England, they still view the KKK, slavery, and all that as wrong. So here's the thing. What made America do what America did? Well, power had a huge part to do with it.
Yeah.
Because again, they were trying to build a new land. So they again had to morally, theologically justify all of these things. Where after a while, once you begin to justify all these things, you have to create a theology, right? You have to create a way of thinking.
Yeah, a system.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to create a methodology of
discipleship.
Of discipleship, but not just discipleship, of addressing problems and arguments that are opposed to you. You have to find a way
kind
to
of suppressing them, baking that into the education and the preaching.
It's
and the
not
culture.
an accident that the people today say echoes of the stuff that Thornwell was saying in the 1800s.
That's exactly what we talked about with Robert B. Jones and what he did with White Too Long. Like, he just drew the historical line forward. And I mean, we mentioned it earlier with the CRT stuff. A lot of the people who think they're being against CRT, like, it's just the same arguments.
It's
100%.
not on accident that these lines are drawn in the same places over and over and over again.
Yeah,
and I want to put a fine point on what you're saying here, Philip, because what I hear you saying is like what Malcolm taught you is to look at something like what happened with the blow up and the abuse of authority and everything at Mars Hill and think the chickens have come home to roost here.
100%. 100%. You think about the sexual abuse that's taking place in evangelical institutions and churches, and how the cover-ups are happening, and how people are being protected, and how women are being abused, and how the leaders are being protected. This is chickens coming home to roost. 100%.
Now I'm gonna be the interlocutor for a second here. So forgive me, but Philip, you're just making everything about race, man.
No, see, I'll be the first one to tell you that if we focus too much on race, we miss the bigger picture, right? Because we can fall into a very similar trap by saying, well, it's all about race. No, race power is what it's all about.
Wow.
And holding on to power, protecting power, right? Power is not something, and because here's the reality. Here's what ends up happening. Now those guys are the evil guys. So if they just give us power and let us be in charge, we'll fix all of this. Think of our forefathers came to America to escape oppression, only to become the oppressors.
That's right.
Power plus sin equals oppression. But when we recognize that the real issue is power, all of a sudden it changes everything. It changes everything. It changes how we view everything. Now, and all of a sudden, chauvinism, racism, all the other isms, right, that can come out of it, you begin to realize that all these things are a manifestation of the misuse and the abuse of power.
Wow. And I would even throw in there the protection of it as well.
100%.
You have to fight for it. Once you know, even if it's unconsciously, once power is threatened, and you want to keep it, you have to protect it. And so that's how those cover-ups kind of start to bleed in, and they didn't do anything, and we had a third-party independent, researchers say and come out conclusions that it was all fine, and then person dies or whatever, and then it's like it all falls out. And it's like, how did we get here? It's exactly what you said, that combination of sin and power seeking and that control, and then that protection of it, and just trying to fight to keep it and keep it and keep it, instead
100%.
of giving that power who it truly belongs to, which is the Lord, and then ultimately seeking to be humble and submit to his power, because he's the only one that could actually wield power well.
Well, and the reality is that we definitely have an earthly power, but the Lord doesn't call us to hoard that power. He calls us to steward it. So when I'm trying to get people to see is, I'm not asking you to give up your power. That's between you and the Lord. But I'm calling you to steward it. Because when you're a faithful steward, sometimes it does mean giving it up.
Yeah.
and sometimes, that's why the whole like defund the police was a wrong conversation.
Huh.
You don't prescribe something assuming that it's just the police, and if the police all of a sudden don't have money or no, it needs to be reformed. It needs to be refined. It needs to be changed, but defunding that doesn't solve. That's just a pendulum swing. That's a reaction. And so when people say give up power, and all that, often now there are some people when, of course, they've been guilty of abusing it. But I'm talking about these broad generalizations of white people just need to give up power, right? And let this no. We're called to be stewards of our power, and sometimes stewardship does mean giving it up. And sometimes stewardship means using the power that you have in order to bless, protect, shepherd, love, care for. There's so many good things that you can do with power when you're a faithful steward of it. And then, but you also recognize, to your point, Vincent, that it's not yours to keep.
Mm-hmm.
And having it is not where your security is found.
Right.
It's not where your identity is found.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I always think about when we start talking about power, what Jesus said to his disciples. The rulers of the Gentiles, they display their authority by lording it over the people that they rule. But it won't be that way among you. Instead, the greatest among you will become like the least.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who is greatest of all will be the slave of all.
Right.
And he said that that's the mentality that we take on, that by laying down, by sacrificing, by putting others first, really what that is putting the priorities of God ahead of, in a sense, self. Not self like self-care in a good way, but like the trying of centralizing and displaying and controlling power yourself, but instead defraying that out into love and service in a different way. Because Jesus had all power, right? He's the ultimate example of that. He stands there on the hill. They come after him with swords at night. Like, we got to surprise him to take him down. He's like, guys, literally, I could call a legion of angels that you couldn't even touch with swords, and I would be free in an instant. But because this is the will of God, I'm going to go with you willingly. By the way, I'm healing this dude's ear because my bro over here with a sword a little bit too quick with that thing. and they still got to learn what I meant by take two swords. But we'll hear this guy's ear on the way to you guys, doing your trumped up abuse of power trial. And I'm going to be abused by the powers that be, because in doing that, I will display a greater power than that.
Man.
And yeah, I mean, there's a huge lesson too for what it looks like to protest, to what it looks like to stand against the evil state in all of those things.
The American church is in a this is a dangerous place, because the reality is that we've all been affected.
Yeah,
it's shaped all of our thinking. You can't be in the American culture, a part of the American culture, without many of the remnants of white supremacy and all that it has birthed rubbing off on you.
Yeah,
that is unfortunately very true.
Yeah. And so I think that there's a humble approach.
That's us too, right?
Yeah. That we all, black, white.
I just want the listeners to hear that. Yeah,
100%. The arrogance that I see in all types of tribes and sects. And the reality is that there needs to be a prophetic voice, but that prophetic voice needs to constantly tremble at the fact that they could have very easily been on the other side of this.
Yeah,
and that apart from the grace of God, absolutely, and apart from God's grace, yep. So I think there's a reality that as we talk about these things, abuse of power, white people don't have the monopoly on power and the abuse of power and the misuse of power. We've all been a part of institutions, churches, inside the church and outside the church, where we have seen power abused, where we have seen the weak silent, and where we have seen those who are lowly and weak be oppressed and taken advantage of. And the other crazy thing about power, and this is sort of the mission that I'm on, is to raise power awareness, because a lot of us have more power than we think we do, more power than we realize.
Wow.
And power is one of those things that, you think about the story of David and Bathsheba.
Yeah.
Regardless of how you look at that story, people, they want to indict Bathsheba. The reality is that David possessed a level of power that it does not matter if she willingly went into his chambers happily, or was charmed going into his chambers, or if she was going into there afraid because she was afraid for her life. And it's probably the latter.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it doesn't really matter, because who was the one that was in power?
Yeah.
100%.
This man was the king of Israel. He was a man after God's own heart. He had it all.
Right.
Yeah. That text says over and over again, he sent, like delegate, like you see his authority, like you're saying.
His will
his
is the one that was
all over that
exerted
text.
and
Yeah,
executed.
absolutely.
100%. So he should have known when I'm working with my team and I ask them to do something, I'm aware of the influence and the power that I have. And so I actually said this to my wife yesterday. People in power don't have the convenience of assuming.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
you got
true.
to ask, are you okay? Do you feel comfortable? Right? When you're in power, you have to go above and beyond to make sure that people aren't simply doing what you ask because they are afraid. And fear has layers. Fear has layers. But what people do is that they like plausible deniability. Well, he never said anything. She never said anything. Why didn't she speak up? She
How
should have said this.
Scandals in court cases? That's exactly what the people in power are saying.
Or even stuff like at work. I mean, folks will be like, "Yeah, you should have communicated." Blah blah blah. Why didn't you say something? Or in ministries, oh well, if there was a problem, somebody would say something.
No.
How does that typically work out?
Check this out. Ravi, I was reading an article from Ravi's PR person, and who's been writing a lot about this stuff. She said that Ravi would go, when she first started working for him, he would leave the team for a day with his 20-something-year-old masseuse, right?
Who traveled and stayed with him.
Traveled with him, and they would leave alone. You know how much power you gotta have?
Come
to
on,
be able to walk,
to wear
and
neck braces and no eyebrows.
Right, no checks, no balances, nobody saying, "Hey, Robbie, what you doing?"
The sermons. Come on, y'all know.
What do they tell themselves? Oh, it's Robbie. They justify it. They create a narrative. Or they know something. They put you can be in denial about these things. Well, he's different. Robbie's just holy. He's one of God's people. Or
he's got back problems.
He's got all day masseuse. some young tenderoni I'm walking away that ain't my wife. Even if my wife was going with me, you still need to be asking questions because I ain't right.
Yeah.
Where's the smoke? Oftentimes there's fire.
Yeah.
And the reality is that people don't ask questions because they're afraid, or because it's just easier. I used to realize that sometimes people don't want to know.
It's true. That is true.
They don't want to know.
Plausible deniability.
Yeah. Less drama. Less drama.
Yeah. Or one of my shout outs a couple weeks ago, there's the book, there's the podcast, and then the HBO documentary just came out on Ronan Farrow's pieces on Harvey Weinstein and how all that came out. A lot of times, if you are anything other than the second person in power, if you do speak up, you get extreme consequences. So it's either
100%.
You got to be completely. Yeah, you got to be either, if you're a part of it, which a lot of times there's value in being part of those organizations, you need to either literally lie to yourself or just put it out of your mind. and just be like, yeah, well, that's just kind of acceptance. Like, that's the way it is here. I can't change it.
Yeah, and that's such a testament to the imbalance of power, because it's like, if I do what is right, then I could pay a negative price for that. And
Yeah, I don't
so
have a
it's like
livelihood, or I
that
don't.
that imbalance of power, not knowing that there are powers, whether it's an organization or a culture, institution, or whatever, to say we will protect the people who are doing what's right, if that means what's right is calling out what's wrong. And it's like the threat of having to be able to be like, well, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my career, I'm going to get
Actual cancel
slandered.
culture.
Yeah, I'm gonna get, I'm
People
gonna lose
actually getting
everything,
axed
and
out
people
there.
are gonna, my image will be tarnished depending on where it is, and it's just
Mhm.
like, that's such an imbalance of power, because it's like you have to count the cost to do just what's right.
Even
Yep,
just to
100%.
speak up.
Huh. So, and here's the reality: being able to be aware of power, your power and power dynamics, positions you better than almost anything else that I can think of, at least right now, to be able to really and truly practice what Paul teaches in Philippians about considering others more important than yourself.
Wow.
Mhm.
Because all of a sudden now you no longer walk away. Somebody was telling me a story, and it was clear to me in the conversation that they were having that this person wanted this leader to speak up and say something, because they had followed Matthew 18 and gone to this person who was also in leadership once and then twice, and they basically decided to leave the institution. And then when the leader, who was aware of what was going on and had encouraged them to practice Matthew 18, basically was like, hey, we don't want you to leave. Their response was, you guys are nice, we appreciate you, but we just think that it's best if we just transition and just transition quietly.
Mhm.
And I'm saying to myself, they're leaving because they didn't want to have to ask you to step in, right? Because you're in power as well. They were waiting on you to say, okay, you follow Matthew 18, now it's our turn to get involved.
Yeah.
They haven't repented, now it's our turn. But nobody wants to ask, because now all of a sudden they feel like they're accused of dividing people and
That's right.
and trying to tear the whole thing down and making a mountain out of a mole and all this. And this leader was extremely sincere, but it was clear to me that this leader just did not see the dynamics of power that was taking place, and it wasn't intentional. They just didn't see it. They were oblivious to it.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so many people in so many situations in institutions where people knowingly and unknowingly, in very subtle ways, use and abuse their power to navigate situations, tweak narratives, not even necessarily anything as scandalous as Mars Hill. I'm just hoping that as Mike is kind of just get going at Christianity Today, because I think there's very few people that are going to have the resources to be able to do what it is that he does. But that other people will actually start talking about some of these stories that are out there now, instead of waiting until 10 years, 20 years after the fact, and then basically telling the story when there's like concrete proof right now that there's grievous abuses taking place. Because the people have been Mars Hill, they just didn't start talking.
Right.
But why is their story just being told?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
And that's not on Mike.
No,
that's not on Mike. But I'm glad he's telling it. I hope he tells more stories. I hope this is not the end. And I hope it's not just people who are outside of our camp. I hope it's people who are inside of our camp.
Yes.
Because Mars Hill,
that.
We have so much to learn.
You know who's trivia? We're gonna shout outs Julie Roy's, man.
Yeah.
She different.
Yeah. Just reading some of her stuff recently, and it's good reporting.
She just don't. And I follow her enough to appreciate her asking the hard questions.
Yeah.
And I hope that she just maintains integrity.
Amen.
Because she's building a powerful platform, but she's different, bro. She's different.
Good shout out.
Well, before we transition directly into the shout outs there, Phil, we've talked about some pretty heavy things here tonight.
Sure.
Look forward to hearing some of what the audience and maybe even some of your people coming over, listening to what you have to say here, answering some questions about it, have to say. But before we get into the shout outs, I do have one last question for you.
Sure.
This came from someone very close to you, told us to ask you, what's your take on Biscoff cookies?
Biscoff cookies are the best airplane treat that you never had. Biscoff.
Wow.
I love those cookies. And since we're talking about powerful institutions,
yeah, bring it back. There you go.
Delta Airlines, if you are listening, what is wrong? Like, what's wrong with you? What? How can you? Delta, and this is how oblivious, right?
They are
People,
to
you
power.
can just make decisions. They are to power. I think.
Yeah.
They tweeted they tweeted this right before I took this flight. When you see the Delta card coming, what's the first thing that you think of? Everybody in the replies, Biscoff cookies.
Boom.
And then I get on the flight and they give me a Cliff Bar, and I'm just like,
a Cliff Bar.
What is this?
Oh no, you didn't.
And it was a sister who was the first time I didn't really like. I was like, oh, they just must be out. Like this is their backup. The second flight I was on, there was a sister who was a flight attendant, and she kind of gave me a look, and I swear I read her mind. It wasn't even I'm sorry. I felt like she hit me with, don't you ask me about them Biscoff cookies. And I knew that people had asked her enough. I don't want this. I want Biscoff. And then finally there was another lady who came in, and I was like, ma'am. I was like, what happened to the Biscoff cookies? And I felt so. That was the first time I felt Delta was represented well, because she actually empathized with my frustration. She was like, I don't know what's wrong with them. She was like, I wish if I could rate you, I would give you a 5-star, because at the very least, you let me know that I'm not crazy. I know you're not in charge of this. I know you don't get to make these decisions. I'm not going to take this out on you. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from.
Kick this out to management.
I told my wife next flight, I was going to order a bunch of Biscoff cookies and wrap and hand them out with a Venmo card to say, hey, if you appreciate this, feel free to scan this and leave a tip. Yeah, and see how much money I can make in the Delta terminal. Yeah, just one box, just with a hey man, hey, if you like Biscoff cookies, hey, here, go ahead and get one, because they got Cliff Bars waiting on you on the flight. Thank you so much. Can I give you anything? There's my Venmo card. But no obligation. No obligation.
Listen to the Make It Plain podcast as you after you eat some Biscoff cookies.
Yeah,
that's the only thing.
Yep.
It's available for free.
That's amazing. Have you had the Biscoff cookie butter?
My wife just introduced me to it, and it made me even more angry. At Delta, we were just in Atlanta, and we went to Trader Joe's, and I had the crunchy and the smooth, and good, googly moogly, man. Yeah,
man, we got a Biscoff apologist here. Oh man,
don't sleep on the Biscoff, man.
Shout out to Biscoff if you're looking to sponsor a podcast in the faith and culture
world. Oh, 100%. Shout out, hey, holla at me. I'll make something work.
Yeah, we tagged Biscoff today.
He'll read ad copy.
I'm thinking and there's not a lot of sponsors I read ad copy for. Biscoff cookies, I could get behind that. I could put my chest in that. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, hey, we appreciate your passion for Biscoff cookies and especially your passions for everything else that you brought today. Seriously, it's been such a joy, and like we just mentioned a little bit earlier, we do a segment with our guests called Subs and Shoutouts, and ultimately we just want to know what you have been reading, what you've been watching, what you've been listening to that has edified you recently, and just share that with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, shout out to one of the things I tweeted this a while ago, but stop asking about CRT, stop asking about racism if you're not reading your Bible. And if you're looking for a resource to help you read your Bible and to walk with you through God's word, because I know a lot of people just aren't reading their Bibles. It's clear to me, especially when you got people going on TV saying, you know, God is dividing the sheep and the goat, and the reporter asks, which one are you? And they say, well, I'm the goat.
I'm the goat because I ain't no sheep.
See, I told you, they're not reading their Bibles.
That was, I would say that was the most.
And that lady is not an exception. She is not the exception. She looks like she's been at church in
decades. She looks like she's been at church her whole life, and then that was her take.
Dang,
she was the rule. She's been more disciple, and there's a lot of other people who have been more disciple. Maybe not as obviously, maybe not as clearly, but have been discipled more by conservative pundits than they have their pastors.
Wow.
So read your Bible. Shout out to John O and Keith, Windows and Mirrors podcast. They have podcasts where they basically walk through the entire word, 4 chapters a day. And the podcast is like 10 to 15 minutes. Right now, we're walking through the Psalms. My wife has been, we're both friends and love Jono, but my wife has been on the podcast since the beginning. I just started walking with them, and we're going through the Psalms right now, and they're doing about 8 to 10 minutes on a Psalm a day. And then they're going to go through the Bible again chronologically in January. So Windows and Mirrors podcast. John, do you guys know John O?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. John O, Cornerstone, Atlanta. Diane
He's
Langberg.
on the list to get to at some point here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, man. John's like John's. To be real with you, John's probably one of the best preachers most people have never heard. Right? When I'm talking about a guy who can handle the text and is a superb communicator.
He's an excellent communicator.
Oh man, yeah. He's probably one of my. He's in my top 3 all time that I've heard. And that's just and I've told him that and you know we and he knows that that's like a compliment, but he's still just a guy. John's a good dude, man.
Dude, I'm subscribed right now
humble, so
on your shout out.
Do it.
I've been looking for that.
The other one that I would recommend is Diane Langberg's Redeeming Power. If you follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, I've been posting a lot of her excerpts from her videos. Her book is really good. The audio book is really good as well. The lady who's reading it, man, she does a phenomenal job reading it. So definitely check that out. Other resource, the Autobiography of Malcolm X. If you want to explore more while we're even going here, and you're looking for a good audio book, whichever one you prefer. Lawrence Fishburne is reading it. Come on, yeah, I mean,
what else do you need?
Go ahead and what else do you need? And there's probably plenty of other stuff that I could name, but those are just the resources that I'm always like super ready to recommend. But I can't forget my wife's book, Mother to Son. If you want something that is engaging but also disarming, or if you're looking to give someone something that is engaging, thoughtful, but also disarming, Mother to Son is actually also has a new book coming out called Carved in Ebony.
That's right.
Looking forward to that.
Y'all got a shop too, right?
Yeah, we do have carvedinebony.shop. Holla at us.
I want to talk to you about that off air. Yeah, I was excited to see you guys launch that.
Yeah, so definitely check out her book. And so Jasmine's Carved in Ebony book is going to be unique. She's also launching a podcast in November as well when the book launches. It's just going to be 10 minute bios on each of the women in the book, and then the next season they're going to explore some other people. But there's so many African American Christians whose stories have never been told.
That's right.
And again, power. He who has the power oftentimes has the microphone.
That's right.
And so this book is going to be really important because you're going to find out about a bunch of godly people that my wife will tell you. She's a historian. She's a researcher. She had never heard of most of the women in the book. Wow. And these were women who led phenomenal, extraordinary lives.
Wow.
So,
I'm excited for that, man.
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's what I mean. That is really the cost, right? At some level, of all the white supremacy, all the stuff we've been talking about right there, right? Like it just cuts you off from people and seeing what God is doing in the world. It makes you blind so much to things that are just glaring logs in our own eyes and stuff like that. And like and so much rich work of grace that the Lord is doing that we would be better off to know about, to interact with, to benefit from,
100%.
so that we could be more loving and gracious people like Christ as well. So man, that kind of stuff gets me super pumped to hear about, because I think that's part of the journey to wholeness, is engaging in all that.
Yeah, what people have to recognize is that, when people talk about, the slave masters and try to talk about the stories of this loving relationship between the slave and the slave master, like he didn't have a choice but to smile, right?
Right.
It was in his or her best interest to look grateful.
That's
right?
the not understanding the power dynamic, the whole thing you just talked about.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
just writ large.
You look beyond the smile. When you understand power dynamics, you look beyond the smile, because you put yourself in that person's situation and you ask yourself, what is that like to live that other? You don't just let yourself easily believe what their facial expression is you think it's communicating. You actually, because sometimes there are people who are in abusive situations and don't even recognize they're in abusive situations.
Wow. So
they're hurting and don't even have the words to articulate why they're hurting. But when you consider others more important than yourself, you're not just accepting the narrative that's easy and that's convenient and that's comfortable.
And without doing that, Phillip, like what you're saying there too, you can't love your neighbor as yourself.
You can't.
How can you love your neighbor as yourself if you don't even understand the power dynamics enough to put yourself in your neighbor's shoes?
No, you completely handicapping yourself. Your quote, Frederick Douglass was the first person who I kind of heard articulate it, but like you said, that white supremacy and oppression warps both sides, and that's so true. Like, whether you think, oh, like they're in power, they have the better end of the deal in like a purely humanistic, materialistic way. Okay, but they're harming themselves. They're harming themselves, and when 100%. It's left unchecked and unaddressed, Jamar talks about that a lot. The cycle of it gets so bad that we have to address it, but then the regression and the entrenchment, and if it doesn't get excised, it stays and gets malignant and grows.
Man, I don't know. We could talk forever. I don't want to start another hour podcast, but that's also how people say ignorant stuff like, "Oh, well, at least when the slaves came over here, they got Christianity."
Oh,
come on. And I listen, in love, right? Just like you said, in love to the folks who just don't, because I didn't understand that once too, right? So in love to the folks who I know and love who don't understand that point. Like, you got to ask yourself, in those power dynamics, could they even get real Christianity from the slave master in those kind of power dynamics?
Yeah.
I mean, there would have to be, not under the normal circumstances, right? Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
There's so many, put it like this. Imagine if, it doesn't really matter. Imagine if Ravi Zachariah lived 200 years ago and was the eloquent and prolific apologist and communicator, and he was in a position of power that essentially shielded him, the whole story from being told.
Mm-hmm.
We would never know. So
That's
even we would never found out. The only reason we found out a lot of the stuff that we're finding out now is because there are no more gatekeepers. People have multiple different, and if one of the media outlets doesn't want to say anything, they can get on the internet and create their own platform and tell these stories. Right. I think there's probably a lot of stuff in history without pointing out to anybody in specific, because I don't know like who these people who was faithful and who wasn't. Ultimately, God knows, and they are being judged, whoever
That's right.
they were. But the reality is that when we get so defensive of historical figures, we need to be really, really careful, because we don't know who we're defending.
And I mean,
that's good perspective.
We don't want to go forever here. We've talked about that before. I remember getting a little bit of heartburn when I first heard props Precious Puritans, but I'm like, no, he's got a point. Like, man, I can't argue with that, actually. When I take emotion and personal fondness out of it, like, he's absolutely right.
Okay, if we could go on a bonus segment that just brought up really quick. Just so, and because me and Philip were talking about this the other day, like, why is it so hard for people to be like, okay, yeah, it's a man of faith, but he was wrong. He made mistakes and stuff like that. But Phil, I was thinking about this, and I think what it is that there's a certain point, though, in our minds when certain actions takes that person out of the category that we've known them in. Like, yeah, famous teacher makes mistakes. That computes. But famous teacher manipulates, covers stuff up, tries to connive, lies. Now I'm
Robbie
having to take him.
Who struggled. He was a man who was,
and I'm not just talking about Robbie, but like even other folks who like that people worship. It's not just that person makes mistakes, but sometimes when we're asking them to see these things, for them, I think it might even take that person out of the category of respected leader and put them into the category of bad person. And I think that's what's hard. It's not that a man of faith is wrong sometimes. It's that a man of faith that I've looked up to and that ostensibly walks with God, knows the word, preaches the word, whatever, is a bad man. And it's like, I thought when you engaged in the word of God in this way and you walked in this life and you believed these things and justification happened, that made like that you became a good man, that the life of Christ would be formed in you. And that you would be a good man. And so here's somebody who did all that, and I believe to be in that category. And the hard thing isn't that people fail, and the hard thing isn't that good men in faith sometimes do wrong things and get stuff wrong. It's that these men that in theory were in the good person category and doing all those things are actually a bad person. Right?
Yeah. And the reality of that is what hits.
Especially when that person is in your camp or leads your camp.
Yeah. Because you can be intellectually knowledgeable that people are depraved. And yeah, sure, the guy that I like is, we're all wretched sinners. And but it's not actually dealing with the reality that person could actually be a wretched sinner. It's more of just like, well, that's what we believe. We believe that as a tenet of our faith, but not as an application of certain individuals.
Well, but even there, like, yeah, he's a wretched sinner, but he's redeemed by grace. And so he's not walking in his wretched sinfulness anymore. It's such that he would lie and put people's lives at danger and would, cover up stuff and, wouldn't just be straightforward and wouldn't care about others and wouldn't care about their well-being. He's taught the word faithfully for X number of decades. So of course, that he's a good person, of course he's done all this good, and you can point to all the fruits of this ministry. I think that's why people struggle.
100%.
I'm not going to lie. I would have that same struggle if like a scandal came out about Paul Washer. I'd have a hard time with that one because Paul Washer has been just a super fire preacher and he's just been super solid. And so I say that because I'm not impervious to that thinking, even though I hope and seek to submit that kind of thinking in a more biblical way where I can just accept the fact and reality for what it is. And that's just a small example, but I say that to say I get it. I 100% people gravitating toward that.
Phil, thank you for your time. We got to have you back sometime. This was good, brother.
Hey, I enjoyed it, guys. Thanks for having me on. This is truly the Substance Podcast. Y'all lived up to y'all's name.
Thanks, bro.
I love that. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
It's good. All right. Have a great night, man. So everybody, that was Phillip Holmes, host
That was an
of
extra.
Make It Plain.
That
Yeah,
was
he gave generously of his time.
It was an XL episode.
Man, really got
That was great.
got some great thoughts flowing for us. You can tell that he is a man who's been thinking deeply and thinking openly through some stuff, and we hope you check out his podcast, Make It Plain.
Yeah, seven great episodes, and like he was alluding to, they'll be back with season 2 at some point. Sounds like they're getting the website launched soon, and actually, by the time you're listening to this, that might be up. And if it is, you can find that in the show notes. So I hope we're able to make a connection actually with Phillip and Biscoff. Biscoff, if you want to throw a couple bucks our way too, that would be great. That would knock out the whole 21 and 21. If Biscoff came and gave us some of those big cookie dollars, we'd take those.
But even if you're not connected to Big Cookie.
No, even if I imagine most of our listeners are not part of Big Cookie. So the way to support the substance, if you like what we do, if you enjoy the show, if you're a fan, if it's something that encourages or edifies you, gives you something to think on and challenge and encourage you, we would love it if you decided to join us and support. The way to do that in the show notes is click the anchor link for our monthly support. We would love it if you were able to, whatever makes sense for you. There's the $5 and $10 a month sign up option on Anchor that helps us with website hosting costs. We're working on getting some merch going, getting some other fun things that we'll hopefully be announcing down the road going as well. That's all funded by you guys. So if you're able to do that, sign up at $5 or $10 a month. We would love it. And if monthly support is not really your style, but you still want to donate and help us here at The Substance, you can do that individually at Cash App. Our tag is $the Substance Pod. You can do it as often or as unoften as you like. And then the Cash App part, it's also cool when some of you guys send us something on Cash App, write us a little note as to which episode you listened to that made you decide to jump on and do that.
Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. That is where you're going to be able to find out who our guests were and who our guests will be. And that's also where we do our giveaways. So if you want to participate in those giveaways, that's exclusively on social media. We've had a ton of amazing giveaways that we've been able to be blessed to give others. And so if you want to participate in that, you have to be following us on our socials. And if you want to leave us a comment or create a post and tag us, that's one great thing that we love, because we want to make sure that this is a community podcast. And so we want to know what you're thinking, what you enjoyed, or what was challenging, and what you want us to kind of go back in and maybe talk about. So interact with us on the socials.
And if any of these discussions or points that Phillip was bringing up today, or that we were bringing up,
it kept tripping me out whenever you would say Phillip. I was like, "What? Oh, not
I know. I knew that was going to happen all the time. The whole podcast. It was just like we had 2 L's and 1 L. We had extras.
Could have called him Phil. Maybe we'll do that next time.
Like come up with some code or something. Anyway, if you can help us figure that out, give us an email, thesubstancepod@gmail.com, with your suggestions on how to figure out guests that have the same name as one of the hosts, how to keep everything straight. Or you can send us testimonials or a voice note.
Give us a call.
Yeah.
Give us a call.
We have a phone.
It's been a while since someone gave us an actual call. I just got an alert the other day. Hey, you guys got a voicemail, and it was an ad.
We're like your grandma. We just want you to call us. Call your grandma, and then call us Substance at 913-703-3883. Boom. That's the podcast, y'all. And we love it. We love that you're here. We'll see you next time
on The Substance.
Peace. Good night.
was gonna make a Biscoff joke, but then it failed halfway through, and I didn't want to give half of a bad joke.
That bread, that Biscoff.